Hi there, welcome to the archives. In this episode, I am doing an audio recording from a blog post titled Nice Nasty White Feminists in Shame. It was originally uploaded on my website under the blogs. I posted this on October the 13th of 2020. Because this post deals with various forms of physical, emotional, psychological, and racial violence, I do want to issue content and trigger warnings. Please proceed with care. Nice nasty white feminists in shame. White American sociologist Michael Kimmel notes that white women who defend violent outbursts from enraged white supremacist men normalize white supremacy's pervasiveness. He said it, not me, though I agree. Kimmel argues that if roles were reversed, that is, and this is a quote, if the phenomenon of white rage had been expressed and exercised with such entitlement as white men, and this is by any other group other than white men, it would be discussed incessantly. But precisely because it is so ubiquitous, so visible, it has received hardly any serious discussion, end quote. And you can find that on page 6 of Kimmel's book. These white women who support them, who are also targets of white male rage, might I add, rarely do they speak up. In cases where white men have abused their power, insulted and offended, oppressed or harmed Black women, and white women were present, in most cases, most still choose to remain silent, if not join in altogether. There are empirical, anecdotal, and scientific research to suggest that when white women in positions of power have been given power over Black and brown women and other women of color, and in excess, they too have fumbled in similar ways as white men. In some cases, white women even participated and inflicted violence against Black and brown women. Enslaved narratives tell stories of the wives of slave masters who were supportive of their husbands and in some cases harmed Black people themselves. We hear stories of rich white women mistreating migrant workers and other hired staff that tend to do domestic and agricultural labor. In corporate and professional workplaces, white women have been documented to treat Black women anywhere from pets to threats. And I invite you to look at Erica Stallings' work that was published in 2019 that looks at this very phenomenon of Black women from pets to threats in the workforce. In some corporate spaces, and the academy, for instance, it has been noted that white women in positions of power discipline Black and brown women by withholding information, sabotaging funding, and other opportunities toward upward mobility. White women police the tone of Black women. Black women are more likely to be micromanaged and surveillanced than their white coworkers. Well aware of the criminalization of Black people and police brutality against Black men and women, white women have been known to intentionally call the police on Black people. See, for instance, Zeba Blay's article that was published in 2020 on Amy Cooper, Central Park Karen. White women are not exempt from what Moya Bailey identifies as misogynoir, which is a disdain and hatred for Black women, which is not only individual but rooted in the systemic and structural. These examples are anti-Black micro and macro aggressions against Black women. We often read a lot of microaggressions, a lot of macroaggressions as micro, and when there's actually nothing micro about it. and I've seen others critique this, if it makes white men racist to do this, then it also makes white feminists who do this as well. But because mainstream white culture sees white women as innocent in comparison to non-white women, we do not always see white women as participants that are guilty of anything, let alone white supremacy. At least they don't want to hear it. White women, including those who identify as feminists, have often bought into the same anti-Black white supremacist programming that white men have. Black African American feminist Doris Davenport in 2015 articulated, and this is a quote, "While Black and white feminists can sometimes work together for a common goal with warmth and support and even love and respect occasionally, underneath there is still another message. That is that white feminists, like white boys and Black boys, are threatened by us." End quote. Of particular interest here is how white women have used their positions of power to erase and diminish the role of Black, Indigenous, and other brown feminists as a way to discharge and minimize their own shame. They avoid, they turn away, they leave others behind, or walk away from Black and brown feminists who force them to face the grave realities of their existence and their role in oppression. This could be an attempt to set boundaries, and also we have to consider as a response to shame. Pro tip, most Black women actually don't mind this relational separation that shame fuels at all. Some of us even prefer this distance between us. Let me share some reasons why. Feminism, broadly understood as universal and all-encompassing, has been the dominant articulation of mainstream white North American feminism. I'm speaking very specifically here about a North American context, as that is all I can speak to as a Canadian, which I was reminded recently by somebody that Canada is part of North America. We don't often consider ourselves American in the same way as the US is. All of it is Turtle Island. It is typically endorsed by, white feminism is typically endorsed by white women in positions of power who assume that they already advocated on behalf of all women, irrespective of their differences. You could see, for instance, Robin Morgan's anthology on global sisterhood as an example. Chandra T. Mohanty's work, however, elaborates on how the voices of women and some racialized upper to middle class Western feminists took up space in the movement and affirmed feminism as unidirectional, flowing from West, here you can read Europe and North America, to the rest, which would be the rest of the world. Some have called it the global South, quote unquote, third world countries. This is a quote, "While white liberal capitalist patriarchies have always been the focus of feminist resistance," Mohanty says, and this is on page 65 of Mohanty's book, which was published in 2003. "This centering of white male domination has meant that the mainstream media has tended to forget or purposefully left out that white women are also oppressed by white men and recipients of their violence. They too are victims of white male power abuse. This is not to make a plea on their behalf in solidarity, but to say that they cannot claim to save any other woman from the shackles of patriarchy when they too have yet to completely figure out how to dismantle it for good. Black feminists, for example, are way ahead of the game. Feminista Jones's book titled Reclaiming Our Space, How Black Feminists Are Changing the World, From the Tweets to the Streets, delves extensively into this topic. But because white North American feminists hold some semblance of power and dominance, feminism is still framed as originating in Europe and North America. You can also see Chandra Mohanty's work on this topic. For this reason, it is falsely believed that white women are more liberated and thus better able to manage, even curb white male power abuse entirely. That's simply not true. It is assumed that white women have been the saviors of feminism, spreading the good news much like some white men have claimed to do. Not to mention that if we are to see white women abused by men, the perpetrator is almost always framed as Black or a racialized man of color, or even racialized women of color. Rarely are white men and women depicted as abusers, much less as criminals. This framing is simply untrue. In actual terms, it has been Indigenous and Black and brown women who have taught white women a lot about what it means to resist patriarchy and work toward dismantling all forms of oppression, not just sexism, as the Combahee River Collective reminds us in their Black feminist statement. Indigenous activists and scholars also remind us that Native, Indigenous, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis women have been and continue to do just fine without the interventions of white women. According to Cree Métis professor Kim Anderson, the idea that white women are the origin of feminist ideals that make up what we call feminism is a distorted myth and inaccurate for matrilineal communities such as the Iroquois, the Navajo, and the Apache. As an Ashanti, I also come from a matrilineal culture that historically valued the role of women, particularly so as decision makers and leaders, respecting the role of queen mothers, much like in Hawaii and other places. Kim Anderson writes, this is a quote, "Where Native women were powerful workers, white women were encouraged to be weak and frail. Where Native women had sexual liberty, white women were restricted from pleasure," end quote. And you can find this on page 272 of Anderson's work. Similarly, Cree Métis researcher and educator Verna St. Denis and academic Cynthia Sturbis argue that Indigenous women native to North America have historically occupied positions of power and authority. I invite you to also check out Don Martin Hill's work. Cynthia Sturbis adds, this is a quote, "European traders had difficulty dealing with Aboriginal women, who in some societies were in charge of furs and whose consent was required before men could complete bargains," end quote. And this is from page 453. Both St. Denis and Sturbis explain that it was Native women who modeled what we now know as feminism, and not their European counterparts, who instead faced subjugation from European men. Sturbis and Anderson both argue that it was the introduction of settlers and missionaries that disrupted traditional Native ways of egalitarian life. This erasure was also the case for Black feminists and other racialized non-Black feminists. For example, within mainstream white feminism, rarely are African women depicted as feminists. Ghanaian feminist writer Ama Ata Aidoo documents accounts of African women who fought for liberation from various European colonizers dating well before 1880. Aidoo directs our attention to ancient Benin circa the 1600s, where an all-female battalions of Dahomey women protected their empire from being invaded. During the 17th century, Queen Nzinga Mbandi fought with uncompromising viciousness to prevent the Portuguese from overrunning Angola. You can also look at Heidi Gazama's Woman King's Invisible Reigns, which was published in 2019 in The Republic. In Ghana, known then as the Ashanti Empire or Kingdom, which is the home of my people and the land of my birth, Queen Mother and soldier Yaa Asantewaa led an uprising against the British during the War of the Golden Stool, also known as the Ashanti-British War of 1900. In Nigeria, Igbo women in the East, this is a quote, harassed the British colonial administration in 1920, and to the point where they had to move their headquarters from Calabar to Lagos. In Zimbabwe, Umbuya Nuhanda was hanged for an insurgency against the British. In Kenya, General Mathoni was a guerrilla leader during the Mau Mau rebellion against the British. Ama Ata Aidoo also calls the names of powerful African women of more recent times who stepped into leadership roles, like Winnie Mandela, Simbongle Nghalbela, Albertina Sisulu, and Zodwa Sobokwe. I'm sorry for any of these names that I pronounced incorrectly. In the Americas, Black women born during the era of slavery, such as Black revolutionary leader Sojourner Truth, was actively engaged in feminist organizing as early as 1851. Sources that address this work include Kimberly Springer's Third Wave Black Feminism, which was published in Signs, Feminista Jones's Reclaiming Our Space, or Gender and Women's Studies in Canada, Critical Terrain, which was edited by Margaret Hobbs and Carla Rice. They all bring our attention to Black feminist figures already actively resisting sexism, slavery, and anti-Black racism, and as far back as the antebellum period. These Black women fought back against rape, forced pregnancy, and separation from their children and families, as Kimberly Springer documents. Notably, Springer highlights contributions from Angela Davis, Deborah Gray White, and Harriet Jacobs. The exclusion of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized voices would remain as such until 1985 or so, when the proliferation of Black feminism, the inception of third wave feminism, and events like the Third United Nations Women's Conference, which was held in Nairobi. Then and now, Black and brown feminists have demanded that white mainstream feminists acknowledge that first and second wave feminism had been fraught with contradictions and exclusion. Hashtag campaigns like Solidarity is for White Women, which happened on Twitter, expose these dynamics on platforms such as Twitter, as Black feminists like Mikki Kendall and Feminista Jones have brought our attention to. But rather than remain open to criticism, white women got, and still get, defensive and accused Black feminists of being dismissive and disruptive. Both Feminista Jones and Mikki Kendall have talked about this, as have others. White women who disagreed with how and what they were called out on claimed that such charges against them were counterproductive and counterintuitive. These debates distracted from feminism's overall objectives, they said. According to shame researcher Brené Brown, this response is very much in line with the discharging of shame. Brown suggests that shame keeps us fearful and unaccountable. I invite you to also look at Barnard's Center for Research on Women, and they posted a video titled How Shame Can Block Accountability. This has to do with the role of shame in stepping into wrongdoing. Sara Ahmed and Brené Brown both discussed this in their research. According to Sara Ahmed, acknowledging wrongdoing can be scary because it opens us up to vulnerability and exposes us to more shame, which leaves us feeling exposed and vulnerable, something most find entirely too threatening. Similar to white men, to discharge any uncomfortable feelings associated with shame, white women have had to engage in a lot of labor to deflect and redirect their shame elsewhere, often through external projection and blame. If in shame, it is believed that others perceive us as bad, then to blame someone else reestablishes a new villain, a new decoy, so to speak. Brené Brown attests, this is a quote, "Blame gives us some semblance of control," end quote. In usurping feminism and blaming Black and brown feminists of being divisive, white feminists get to take charge and set the terms and conditions according to their agenda in order to silence dissenting voices that bring up white shame. This is because shame functions as exposure, and what is exposed exposes us as shameful. We hide or omit because we sense and fear exposure, and how being exposed will make us look to others. These historical facts of Black and Indigenous feminist engagement, or rather, women's liberation, because not all who do feminist work identify as feminists, like Alice Walker and most womanists, or Indigenous and other women of color. In any case, if these narratives of women resisting patriarchy globally, if they were to become more well known and in the mainstream as they are now, this would and does mark white men and women as shameful for having tried so very hard to suppress this data from the mainstream. Because non-white content has always existed, even outside of the mainstream context. White women have every reason to be ashamed of those in their lineage and ancestry who reframed and erased history in such a way that it favored them, and only them, and through erasure of others. That is shameful. Erasing, blaming, judging, projecting, deflecting, and covering up. These are some mechanisms that are at the very crux of the definition of shame. The word shame has Germanic roots and comes from the European Goth word sham, which means to cover or covering of the face. I invite you to look at Sara Ahmed and Elspeth Probin's work. Not surprisingly, shame functions precisely in this way. It covers and makes us want to hide. It silences and produces secrecy. We hide what we find shameful. I imagine it is shameful to admit that those you look down upon are in reality the same as you, maybe even better. I, like most, get why white people hide these historical and current facts that highlight brown and Black people in all of our glory. As a shame researcher, I know firsthand that this is how shame operates. Shame will move us how it does, particularly so when we are not aware of how it moves us. Shame is actually loaded with so much juicy data once we learn how to decode, shape, and work with it. But many of us don't even want to talk about shame, so we don't know how to work with shame, let alone sit in shame and redirect it away from us so we no longer feel shame. White shame informs what gets written out of history, how it is edited, and by whom. These shameful aspects of white history are intentionally suppressed because they mark white people as shameful. White people refuse to be represented in such a way that marks them in too close of a proximity to Black or other racialized people, who they believe they are more superior than. Imagine humans on a spectrum. Most white supremacists like to think of themselves as far away from Black and brown people as possible. By erasing historical facts that they are ashamed of, and by focusing instead on right-wing conservative propaganda that makes them feel prideful, rageful, and pseudo-powerful, white men and women continue to dodge their shame. Avoiding shame in this context becomes a major driving force in white women's support of white men, even if they are white supremacists, and regardless of how violent and fascist they are. White women encourage these white supremacist men because they too would rather not deal with their shame. As Michael Kimmel points out, these rage-filled white terrorists rely on the support of women as, and I quote, the motivation for their mobilization. It's time more white women assess their relationship to white supremacy, admitted that they are racist, and found ways to eliminate and eradicate it within and around them, not just individually. But also the structural and systemic racism, even if it favors you. Yes, you will have to lose out on some things. Resources will have to be reallocated in order to make way for mutual stretching. You may even have to suffer a bit. Plot twist? Welcome to the club. Most non-whites have been in some struggle or another. And yes, white people too. I speak of nuances in white experience based on different white ethnicity in my dissertation. And it is also true that all white people still could and will never understand the struggle of what most Black and Indigenous people experience. White supremacy is not an isolated issue in only white communities. I wish that were the case. We would be up against a whole lot less. No, it's not just white women who fall prey to white supremacy either. I myself have had to pay attention to internalized anti-blackness as it pertains to my Black womanhood. What this means is that not one of us can escape white supremacy, not even white women. Further to this, white supremacy has the support not only of white women, but a vast majority of non-white populations globally. More to come on this topic in a future blog. For now, I will say imperialism, colonialism, turbo-capitalism, globalization, sexism, racism, anti-blackness, ableism, Zionism, the list could go on. What a piece of work these encounters are. Are you a white woman? Do you identify as a feminist? Do you find this offensive? How open are you to engaging in uncomfortable conversations that make you look bad and name you as the oppressor? Do you have other white family and friends who talk about this? What resources have you read, watched, or listened to lately that has helped you tap into this discomfort? Did anyone call you a racist today? Did I incite white rage in you? What about shame in you? Does it offend you that I classify emotions according to race? Does the word white make you uncomfortable and cringe? Does a combination of white and shame together make you especially mad? Real white anti-racist people, they get it. Or at least they say they do. But we all know you mess it up in practice and all the time. Most of us do, myself included. It's just that Black women tend to be more honest and more willing to admit our feminist mess ups. I think it's time that more white feminists try to do the same. Get real. Keep it real. Be honest. Tell the truth about your messy. What have you hidden and covered in shame? Black women will continue to tell the stories that have always written us into history. We cannot and will not be erased. If this resonates, please pass it along and share it with others. If it doesn't, that's okay too. Like others, I and my words are not meant for everyone. If it is for you, please consider making a donation to my PayPal at The Archives. I'm also on Buy Me a Coffee at the same handle, The Archives, which is DEEA Archives, or just Archives. Thanks for stopping by. Until next time, in solidarity.